All right, the administrative part as well as the speaking. During my last lesson, I mentioned that we're created in the image of God, and we discussed that a bit during the question and answer time. And I decided to use that as my theme for this week and discuss it further. Scripture clearly states that all creation, things and beings, are dependent on God. In Nehemiah 9:6, we read, Ezra said, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that are in them, and you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you." Or in the New Testament, in Acts 17, verse 25, God himself gives mortals life, breath, and all things. And then in verse 28, in him we live and move and have our being. The phrase the image of God is found 3 times in the Old Testament, and all of them are in Genesis. The first time this idea is mentioned is in the creation story in Genesis 1, which Jeff read for us. Genesis 1, beginning verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over all the cattle, and all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created mankind in his image, and in the image of God he created them, male and female, he created them. The next mention is in the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them mankind when they were created. The third passage is in Genesis 9. It's after the flood, and God establishes a covenant with Noah and his descendants. Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by human shall have that person's blood be shed. For in his own image, God made mankind. Some have claimed that humans lost the image of God at the fall, but here, this is after the fall, it's after the flood. Mankind is still described as having been created in the image of God, and there's a result of that. And a passage from the New Testament, and to set the context, I'm going to read a little bit longer passage here. This is in James chapter 3, beginning in verse 2. For all of us make mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes is speaking perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they're so large that they take strong winds to drive them, yet they're guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a small member, yet boasts of great exploits. How great is a forest set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and itself on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creatures can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Father, the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who were made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this not ought to be so. Does it spring forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, yield olives or grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. As I looked at the passage dealing with the image of God in Scripture, I noticed that the passage that applied the concept, Genesis 9 and James 3, were about how we treat other people. In Genesis 9, we should not murder because God made humans in his own image. Or in James 3, we should not curse each other because we are made in the image of God. The concept of the image of God, while on the surface deeply theological, is also very practical. How we treat people is based on the realization that they, like us, are created in the image of God. Scripture presents humans as created persons. We do not exist autonomously or independently, but are created by God. The image of God is a biblical concept that denotes the relationship between God and humanity, and consequently undergirds the notion of intrinsic human dignity. This idea demonstrates the fundamental value of human beings. As every human being is created in the image and likeness of God, all people share in the same origin and are equally valuable for God. A focal point of this theological implication is the concept of human dignity, a concept that assigns every human person intrinsic or de facto universal value that cannot be negated. As a source of existence and purpose of humanity, God claims the dignity of all human beings, and all human persons are thus granted dignity. A significant aspect of the commonality of human beings is that we all have a different sameness. Differences are part of being human beings, such as we're created, each of us, with unique gifts, traits, and abilities. For example, the difference between man and woman is symbolized by gender differences in Genesis chapter 2. Human differences become the ground as our nature as helpers who can support and complement each other with our own strengths through mutual recognition and fellowship. Difference further undergirds various types of communities and societies where they offer solidarity. Difference points to union, as stated in Genesis 2:23, "This at last is the bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." In other words, human relations established by the biblical concept of the image of God is a social connection, unity in difference. The image of God serves as a theological foundation for human rights. As humanity is divinely created and thus humans have equal dignity intrinsically by their nature, every person is a bearer of the rights and cannot be denied or violated. Essential rights are gifts that are bestowed by God as a way to fulfill God's desire and design for creation. The duties that are required to ensure individuals' rights are both duties of non-interference and those that require positive support. Human rights include negative rights, referred to as freedom from something, including civil and political rights such as freedom of life, speech, political private property, religion, a fair trial, and freedom from violent crime and slavery. Such rights referring to, as well as positive rights, referring to freedom to receive something, such as rights to food, housing, public education, employment, minimum wage, Social Security. Negative rights impose a negative duty on others, a duty not to interfere. Positive rights place a positive duty on others to provide support through action. On a slightly different note, Peter, in 1 Peter 16, quoting the passages in the 11th and 19th chapters of Leviticus, says, "Be holy because I am holy." We're called to be holy, but we're never called to be in the image of God because that's how God created us. It's not something we aspire to, it's something we are. And yet it does affect our actions because we're to treat others differently because they are created in the image of God. The concept of people being created in the image of God endows everyone with dignity and worth. I suspect that's why Jesus so often uses the examples of those on the margins of society. I think he wants to emphasize that those whom society marginalizes, such as the poor, widows and orphans, the foreigner, the prisoner, they too have dignity and worth and are contrasted by those that society recognizes as having worth. As Amos describes those as those who are at ease in Zion and those who feel secure on Mount Samaria, the notables of the first nations to whom the house of Israel retorts, those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp like David improvised on instruments of music, who drink wine from bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oil. In short, the rich, the powerful, the comfortable are not worth more than they are marginalized because we're all created in the image of God.